Let's see. Okay. So, speaking of challenges and opportunities. So first of all, some of these are kind of, in another way, paraphrasing some of the stuff that Art emphasized. Like many parts of the U.S. and the planet, actually, we're seeing with an average temperatures going up. Plants and ecosystems don't respond so much to average temperatures, but really to the frequency of exceeding extreme events. And so we're seeing more heat stress, increased risk of both drought and flooding in this area, and also getting more difficult to predict. Climate change is more complicated than just warming, and I've got another slide kind of emphasizing what Art talked about. Years ago, we were we always talked about the silver lining in our area of having a longer frost-free period, that trend opening up all kinds of opportunities for farming, but we are seeing that water challenges are kind of interfering with that and offsetting that a bit. And then all of this is, of course, also affecting not just our plants or animals, but changing pest disease and weed pressures. Now, many places I go to talk outside of the Northeast, the southwestern U.S., I do work in East Africa. There's very little to put on the other side of the screen, but I think one thing we can say about the Northeast, there's a few things that we can think about. Partly it's just that we're not as in bad a shape as some other regions in terms of what's projected. One thing is this increased frequency of heat stress. Well, we're not starting at as warm temperatures as other regions, so the level of heat stress we're going to reach, although it's going to be more prevalent than we've seen in the past, isn't as extreme as people in other regions where it's already plenty warm for crops. Their heat stress can be more dramatic. And with the water challenges, certainly, and I'll provide a lot of detail on some recent analyses of these risks with drought and flooding and impacts they're having. But compared to other regions, we do have lots of fresh water resources in the Northeast. And we don't have projections, projections for water are not so draconian that they're predicting we'll have really major hydrological droughts with the Great Lakes and our Finger Lakes and streams drying up completely year after year, but more frequent short-term summer droughts. And then there is this positive thing of the longer frost-free period. If we, in those years when we don't have water challenges interfering with that, there's opportunities for growing higher yielding crops, exploring the new crop options, double cropping. I'll be talking a little bit about soil health in my talk today, and one aspect of that is growing winter cover crops, and there's more opportunities for introducing those into cropping systems with a longer frost-free period. So some real opportunities we can think about here. And so the real bottom line for us in the Northeast, I think, is working with farmers to move us towards the right-hand side of the picture as much as possible and take advantage of those opportunities to compensate for some of the new challenges. But we have to make it clear to farmers that farming is going to get more challenging here, just like everywhere else, but it's not entirely bad news, and there's some opportunities we could explore. Okay, this is another angle on looking at climate data that I kind of like to use and I sort of think about sometimes, and also it's very familiar to people who are home gardeners or farmers. Many are familiar with these plant hardiness zones. Basically, the color zones are based on the coldest it gets in the middle of winter, affects the range of different types of ornamental plants you might plant in the garden, or the things that farmers might grow in their fields. And so first reaction to a gardener or a farmer might be, oh wow, this is, I can do something that they're doing south of here that I've always wanted to do, grow a particular crop or whatever, and now I might be able to do that. In fact, both these maps, 1990, 2006, developed exactly the same way, looking at the last 15 years of actual weather station records. And you can see no matter where you live in the US or Northeast, you're probably in a different hardiness zone than you were in the past. So there are those positive features to this. But as an ecologist, when I look at this, I know that we're not going to see entire complex ecosystems and all those species interactions migrating en masse as these climate zones shift. So we're very concerned about decoupling of important species interactions, such as pollinators and earlier bloom of plants and that kind of thing. Another thing is this, when I look at this, one of the first things that comes to my mind is insects, winter, really cold-blooded organisms. They pretty much follow the temperature in terms of their range. So we're seeing shifts in the range of crop disease, insect, and disease pests coming forward. In fact, that's a big problem for us in the Northeast. This just kind of emphasizes this. These are a couple insects, and kudzu, very notorious invasive weedy plant, very familiar to people in the South. And but we actually did project about 10 years ago that kudzu would be moving northward based on the the temperatures increasing in our winter, and in fact we are now, it's actually being documented that's happening. The flea beetle is not such a bad insect on its own. Normally, except for on young transplants, doesn't do a lot of damage, but it is the vector of Stewart's wilt, a very important corn disease, and corn earworm is a problem we're seeing more of today. I don't know what happened there. Coming back to the water story. So this is just saying again what Art had mentioned. Longer frost-free growing period, possibilities of some options. But what we're seeing is farmers not being able to get into the field to plant and actually having a short growing season. One of our a grower panel we had a few years ago had a corn grower there whose family's been in the business for many generations. And he gave an interesting story of, for a couple of generations, their family always grew, I forget what it was, 80 to 85 day corn. He had heard me give a talk a couple of years prior to his being on this grower panel about longer frost-free period. They started exploring longer growing season varieties. And in fact, they worked and those yield better and they were very excited about that. But then they got whammed about 3 years in a row with rains going all the way into June, and they had some of the shortest growing seasons they'd ever seen. And so he tells a story that, for many generations, we've grown 80 to 85 day corn, and now we plant everything from 75 to 110 day corn. So this diversification is a big strategy that farmers use. But it makes farming, a more complicated thing, and they have to kind of hedge their bets with that diversification. This is one of a graphic from the paper that came out in Climatic Change on the Northeast crops. This graphic is showing just for 2013 to 16 some actual crop losses reported throughout the Northeast. This was put together by Mary Carey, one of the co-authors on this. Dave Hollinger contributed as well. And other co-authors on that included Art DeGaetano has been mentioned, Greg Peck, Mike Hoffman, several other folks. Anyway, so in that 3-year period, you can see we had plenty of drought issues, moisture issues, heat, and as has been mentioned, Art mentioned the apple frost. I never imagined when I got into this 25 years ago that one of the grower groups that would be calling me out most often to talk about climate change would be the apple growers to talk about frost and freeze damage in a warming world. They're very ironic. But in fact, we have seen quite a bit of incidence of that in the recent past. And as Art mentioned with the data analysis we did with our paper, documented this may actually be an increasing problem for a short period of time, and then eventually we phase out of that. But the farmers, it's not just anecdotal information, I think, but a real trend we're seeing now and something we have to deal with. I thought now I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple other papers, a couple other research projects, one focusing on drought and the other focusing on flooding that just recently happened in our area. This is work done by a postdoc of mine, Shannon Sweet, and Art was involved in this as well. And so in 2016, across the Northeast, we had a very relatively dry year, most parts of the Northeast. New York was particularly hard hit, I think Massachusetts as well. This was a farmer survey that was done focusing on New York, since we were one of the hardest hit areas. Especially you can see as we went into the late part of the season, Western New York, total record-breaking drought. Really, not only was it a hot spring and summer, but the snowpack had been light in the previous winter, so we had streams drying up, wells drying up, ponds drying up. So kind of a case study of how bad it can get and how did farmers respond. So that's kind of what this is about. So here's the impacts based on this farmer survey of estimated crop losses. And I don't want to go into a lot of details about this, but the upper left-hand graphic is talking about our rain-fed field crops. And we divided the data into Western New York, A and B, and Eastern New York to separate out the areas that were most hard hit, the Western New York. But you can see, even including just averaging them together, more than half of our rain-fed acreage we estimated more than a 30% loss. And in Western New York, actually, the average was many of the farmers reporting more than 50% loss. And what's even more interesting, when you look down at vegetable and vegetable acreage, we had both irrigated and rain-fed vegetable farms, and even the irrigated vegetable acreage had more than 30% loss in Western New York. meaning really that they have irrigation equipment, but not enough to keep up in this kind of year. So that's kind of where we're at. That's kind of the vulnerability we have with our vegetable crops and fruit crops in this region, where the farmers have some irrigation equipment, but not prepared for these kinds of more serious years, which may become slightly more frequent in the future. Getting into adaptation and what farmers thought about all this, here's some things what they thought most limited. They really had serious issues with just water supply in that kind of year and not enough irrigation equipment, as I already said. We asked them, what about the future? Do you think that this is going to change how you look at things in the future? And in fact, of course, not surprisingly, they said yes. Developing water resources, some things about water are kind of highlighted there. This was for a prior water conference we were at. But what also kind of intrigued me was the last one, how many farmers recognized what was mentioned previously, soil health. Farmers already, I think this is part of our educational program that many of us have been involved with. Farmers are recognizing the importance of soil organic matter, soil health, water holding capacity, and resilience to drought. Okay, that was 2016. This postdoc who just came to work with me in 2016 had to jump into this drought story. And then the next year, she's a 2-year postdoc, it's flooding. And she's making hay with that now too. This is the counties where we've done a survey. It's kind of still in initial stages. This data is just about to be published in some extension journals. We haven't yet got we have a peer-reviewed paper out on the drought story. But so we did a farmer survey here in terms of the heavy rainfall. And the darker green areas are those parts of New York where we had very serious flooding. It wasn't quite as dramatic, as extreme record-breaking as the drought in 2016, but serious enough where farmers are seeing big gully washers, lots of soil erosion, et cetera. And significant crop losses, particularly on heavier soils, and the higher value vegetable crops saw a lot of damage. And in terms of this also, farmers also recognized a lot the benefits of practices associated with soil health in terms of better drainage, et cetera. So that was interesting. And to just emphasize this story about soil health, I think Randy already kind of alluded to this. It's a low-cost climate change resilience with strategy with many other benefits for farmer productivity that we've been talking about for a long time. But it also, of course, is a mitigation strategy, storing carbon in soil that otherwise would be in the air as CO2. We asked the farmers about what would they do differently with this wet summer if they had known about it. Primarily, it was about pretty intuitively expanding drainage capacity and also changing the fertilizer chemical inputs to take into consideration the runoff issue. There was the mention earlier by Randy about communication, and you can't be working on climate change and farmers for 25 years and not become a student of communication strategies. And I think, this is sort of some summary of sort of what I think I've learned over those years, and many of you may have had similar experience. Certainly even from the beginning, I never had a problem talking to farmers about extreme weather events. You can get a group of farmers as full a room as this, ask them who wants to talk about the extreme bad weather, and you'll get lots of conversation, and that's the entry point as far as I'm concerned. More recently, because farmers are really seeing some impacts on their farms, many are concerned with extreme weather, and it's becoming more frequent and less predictable. They're recognizing that. Many farmers are moving away from the calendar, they're at least aware of that. Sometimes there are some logistical problems with doing that. And there's actually been some polling data now looking at farmer attitudes about climate change. The most important one probably by Arbuckle in the Midwest. About 4,500 farmers surveyed. Make a long story short, about 66%, 67% of the farmers said they thought the climate was changing. Not all of those folks were convinced humans were the main cause, but they're open to adaptation. And only 2 or 3% said they absolutely just don't believe in climate change. So I think the doors are open to talk to farmers about this. Here's the long laundry list of the things that farmers can do to build resilience to climate change at the farm level. I already mentioned diversification. One challenge with that for farmers is if you have a really good year, a quote normal year, if you've diversified to hedge your bets in case there's a bad year, you might be able to not be able to take advantage of the best years in terms of not all your acreage is in your best crops, et cetera. New varieties, breeding and biotechnology, and I'll come back to that question that was raised before. IPM, we have to think carefully about farmers, adapting to more pest problems by increasing chemical loads and trying to do a better job with IPM so we are better prepared for that. Soil health, we've already talked about, irrigation drainage systems, fruit crop frost protection strategies, many things farmers can do. And an interesting one that's kind of surprised us is farmers actually purchasing larger scale equipment to deal with more acreage more quickly, finding smaller windows of time. They're convinced there's such a reduction in the windows of time they have to plant or to harvest. God, sorry, I lose my voice. That, for example, in the Midwest, farmers are buying bigger planting equipment. They have big stuff already, but to do more rows because they think the rains are really messing them up. In the Northeast, we're seeing them for harvesting hay, getting bigger equipment, et cetera. So interesting adaptation strategy, a significant investment to adapt to climate change. Although these farmers are kind of doing this intuitively, may not even recognize they're adapting to climate change. We worry about farmers and equity issues, social justice issues, some small family farms. Sometimes it might be a fairly straightforward capital investment that could really carry the day for them for many years in terms of adapting to climate change, but those things aren't cost or risk free. There's also other barriers to adapting to climate change, even though a farmer may think they know what it is. One thing is just it's coming at them from all angles and very different types of information. Everybody's got, looking at their cell phone and can Google stuff and say, find a different opinion, despite what this poor scientist is trying to explain here. Here's kind of a quick list of some farmer constraints to farmer adaptation. Of course, the financial barriers, informational barriers, cognitive barriers. It's just complicated stuff sometimes, dealing with uncertainty. Technological limits, we might not have the solutions. Social and cultural barriers. The social group you belong to may not believe in climate change, and then you've got your head in the sand. And then we might really the climate change might get so bad, we have no option. We have very few options available to us, so we hope we don't go there. So what we really are about at Cornell, and I think this is what this hub is about in a lot of ways, is helping farmers deal with this thing of, is this, quote, normal variable weather, or is this really something worth an investment? And that's where some of our tools are about. So I think the role for the hub, for universities, NGOs, government agencies, here's kind of the list: new decision tools to help farmers explore these things, financial assistance, seasonal climate forecasts. If farmers have a better heads up, it's going to be a rainy year or a dry year, can really help them a lot. Plant breeding and biotechnology, et cetera. And I think I'm running low on time. So I did want to make a couple comments about the genetics and plant breeding. So my take on that is it's crucial. We have to take everything we've got available and use that to help us deal with climate change. But it's not the silver bullet. One problem is that it's unpredictable what's going to happen in a particular area in a particular year. We could have like the most incredible biotechnology breakthrough developing drought-tolerant corn varieties, but a farmer will still have to be guessing, but is this going to be a dry year or the wettest year I've ever seen? And so they would still have to be diversifying. They could grow that new biotechnology, crop, but they'd probably want to also grow some that are maybe be able to handle the flooding. So that's a challenge. Stress-tolerant varieties often have low yield potential, and so from that standpoint, biotechnology may help us overcome that barrier. Stress tolerance is not like some of the insect and disease stresses where it's a single or few genes. They're often very complex, unique suites of genes depending on the timing of the stress. So you might have a variety that's tolerant to stress at particular growth phase but not another. And actually one problem we have is most of the biotechnology breakthroughs are coming in the main world food crops like corn and wheat. And we have a lot of high value horticultural crops that are important for our area. And then some farmers, of course, because of their markets or their own beliefs, are concerned about GMO crops or the people they're selling to. And so that's puts some barriers to fully taking advantage of what biotechnology might bring. So last couple slides. So another angle we have of solving this and adapting to this is really there's some great state-of-the-art stuff happening now, really a lot of breakthroughs in sensor technology for monitoring, data analytics, decision tools, and to help farmers in assessing this adaptation. And I'll quickly go through this list. This is my last slide. Taking advantage of changing market opportunities is one of the ways to discuss this with farmers. Strategic decisions such as diversifying crops, capital investments. These are some of the reasons why farmers really need to be paying attention to climate change data. Anticipating new weed, disease, insect pests. Avoiding unintended consequences such as chemical loads to waterways, undesirable land use change. And farmers who can get involved with this can help promote policies that can actually help them provide incentives or low-cost loans for adaptation and mitigation. We're not really talking about mitigation today, but one entry point for getting into that story with farmers is talking about energy efficiency, which farmers are all about, and renewable energy on the farm, and that's a great place to enter that dialogue. And I think I'll stop there. I see a question.
Why do we need to say climate change?
Oh, why do we have to use those words?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have to. It depends on the audiences, I think was mentioned, and how you're trying to engage people and not immediately get a knee-jerk, pulling back from you. So you can talk about changes in seasonal weather patterns, can talk about, just concerns about extreme weather. So we don't have to do that. I think climate change is as a scientist, I think it describes very well the story. I like the fact that we've moved away from warming because it's not just about temperature. It's about water and temperature and various things. So does that answer I don't know if that answers that question.
So after the 2016 survey
of
farmers after drought, you had stated intentions for changing action.
Yes.
Do you have any plans to follow up, say this year or next year, to see if they actually have implemented that, especially when that they went from drought to flood?
Yeah. Well, we haven't really planned a follow-up survey, but that's a very, very good point. And I think after the whammy of the two very different years, it'd be sort of interesting to go back and get the input from these farmers about what they think about all of this, both the drought and the flooding. And we do have the surveys were done anonymously, but at the end we allowed them, if you would allow us to come back to you for some more detail, and actually in both those surveys, more than half of the farmers agreed to that. So we have some people the same people we could contact. So that would be an excellent idea. Okay, I think I should stop there.
Thank you very much.